now immigration has changed French society in a way that is partly irreversible. I mean, if you look at birth data, for example, in 2023, for the first time in history, you got more than 30% of all births, of all newborn babies recorded in France, which were born to at least one parent born outside of the European Union. So, of course, this is a dramatic demographic shift. And this is something that happened without any level of democratic consent, actually.
Now, obviously, your expertise is on France, so I want to focus on France today. How bad is the immigration situation in France in 2025?
Well, I guess it can only be referred to as an immigration crisis. I mean, we live in a paradoxical moment in which the French public has never been that opposed to the current levels of migration. When you look at opinion polls, you always get between 2/3 or 3/4 of the French who say there is currently too much immigration in France, on the one hand, but on the other hand, there has never been as much immigration in France as over the last few years. Like the number of first-time residence permits issued every year has been multiplied by 3 over the last 2 decades. The number of people who are granted asylum has tripled, over the last 10 years. So all the metrics, all the immigration indicators are on the rise. And it explains largely why immigration has now risen to prominence as the number one topic in French politics.
What kind of impact did it have on recent French elections? How does Macron handle the issue politically and so on?
Well, it's fair to say that there has never been as much immigration in France as under Macron's presidency. In the latest elections, immigration was the second most important point for voters to decide who they were going to vote for, along with the cost of living in the European elections, which took place last June. A few weeks later, as you know, a snap election was called, and it was also the number 2 issue in the first round of the general election. Then the second round was about something else, either you were for Rassemblement National or against Rassemblement National, and if you were against Rassemblement National, then you voted for the opponent, no matter what the opponent was. But what is obvious is that immigration is going to be the number 1 issue in the upcoming French presidential election, which should take place 2 years from now if Emmanuel Macron does not resign by then. The problem is that the snap election I just mentioned resulted in a hung parliament with a minority cabinet, and it seems very difficult to pass through any significant legislation on immigration up until there is a clear majority for this in parliament.
Can you talk about how French society and culture has changed over the last 30 years as a result of immigration? Our British viewers will know very well if you go to places like Birmingham or parts of London. It's a very heavy immigrant population in kind of ghettoized areas. Has the same thing happened in France?
Yeah, it has for sure. Now in France we have something around 22% of the population, which is either immigrant itself or second generation immigrant. We have strong geographical specificities within our immigration. For example, we have the most African immigration of the whole of the European Union. Half of immigrants in France come from Africa. A slight majority of them are from North Africa, so Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. And the other part is from sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, the number of sub-Saharan immigrants in France has doubled over the last 15 years, so the demographic trend is still that one. And of course, it has changed French societies in ways that no one actually expected, no one actually voted for either. There are many features that have changed, but perhaps one of the most significant one has to deal with the religious landscape of France. France now has the largest Muslim population in Europe, and this is entirely due to immigration. There was no native Islam in France, apart from 1 or 2 overseas territories. So basically, all Muslim people in France are either immigrants themselves or second or third generation descendants of immigrants. It has shifted France's culture, and it has also bring into the political agenda topics that were not discussed at all because they did not exist. In France there is this ongoing debate about the Islamic scarf, whether you should be allowed to wear it at school or not, about halal meals in schools, this kind of thing that did not belong to the French habits, neither to the French political discussion, but which have now risen to prominence as the center ground of France's culture war, which of course has to deal with other social issues, but truly immigration and its cultural consequences are now the hardcore of this culture war.
So you mentioned certain countries in North Africa like Algeria, but also in sub-Saharan Africa where France may have had an imperial legacy. And in Britain there's a huge argument from some on the left who say, well look, we had the British Empire, we have to let these people in, it's our moral obligation. We basically colonized these countries, we took their resources, and now it's only fair that we let them come to our country and benefit from British society and riches and culture and so on. I presume similar arguments are made in France. Maybe you can tell me if they are, and if so, how do you respond to those arguments?
Yeah, absolutely, and they are especially done on the Algerian case. Algeria was a French territory up until 1962, and there is still a strong degree of resentment within the Algerian population, which is mostly instrumentalized by the Algerian regime, which is an autocratic regime whose only legitimacy comes from the independence war. So of course this argument is often made on Algeria and on other former French colonies. I would say three things. The first is that morality and politics are two different things. It's not politics is not immigration policy, and public policy in general should not be about repairing any sort of moral evil from the past. It should be about what is the common good now for having a coherent and peaceful society in which to live. The second thing is that this argument relies on the idea that the colonial period was all bad. Of course, there were significant flaws in it. There were significant unfairness and injustices, but yet you cannot look at it only as an entirely oppressive project with even not a slight good aspect to it. So that's a third point. And thirdly, the issue is that the kind of post-colonial immigration we have in France tends to be doing specifically badly on a wide range of integration metrics, whether you look at employment, you look at education, you look at the share in social housing. You always get a significant share of Algerians, of sub-Saharan Africans, and this kind of difficulties does not magically disappear after the first generation of immigrants. You can, for example, in France, you've got half of all Algerian immigrants living in social-based housing. And if you look at the second generation, it's still 44%, so almost exactly the same. I would say a sensible and committed politician should be thinking about today's public good, and today's public good does not have to be dictated from any sort of post-colonial guilt.
You mentioned that the French public have never voted in favour of mass migration of people into France. So why has this happened in any case?
Well, I would say the same phenomenon were at stake in France as in many other European countries, as in the UK, for example. During the 60s and 70s, there was some sort of economic lobbying for large unskilled immigration, because it was the time of economic boom, it was the time of industrial development for France, and some economic sectors, for example the car industry or the building industry, they relied a lot on imported immigrant labor, partly because it helped to lower the average level of wages in the French labor market. Then after the 70s and after the post-war boom finally ended, I would say we went into a second time of immigration policy history, which was mostly family-based, mostly rights-based. It was not a result of any thought-through immigration policy in touch with economic needs. It was an immigration policy that was dictated by judges, more and more also by European law. France, among other specificities, has the most family-based immigration within the whole of the European Union, and family-based immigration is heavily protected by the French Supreme Courts, by EU law, by ECHR. So it's actually politicians did not actively want this family-based immigration.
So just to clarify what you mean by that, that's if an immigrant is coming, they can bring their whole family too with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like over a period of 15 years from 2005 to 2020, more than 40% of permanent immigrants who settled in France have come on a family-based residence permits, so for family motives. Of course, this has many consequences as regards economic integration, as regards their skills levels, etc. But I would say politicians just gone along with it. Perhaps a part of them, especially in some segments of the left, were quite happy with it because they saw it as some sort of potential substitute electorate. In France as elsewhere, the historical alliance between the political left and the working class seems to have vanished over the last 4 decades for several reasons. And a part of this left saw this new immigrant population and its descendants as some sort of potential voters, potential new minorities on which to build victorious coalitions. But even within the electorate of the French left, there was never an actual majority for more immigration. And the thing is, now immigration has changed French society in a way that is partly irreversible. I mean, if you look at birth data, for example, in 2023, for the first time in history, you got more than 30% of all births, of all newborn babies recorded in France, which were born to at least one parent born outside of the European Union. So, of course, this is a dramatic demographic shift. And this is something that happened without any level of democratic consent, actually.
When you're looking at France's demographic trends, will there be a point in this century when ethnically French, white French people will be a minority in France?
Well, it's sometimes hard to state in France because the level of data we have from public institutions is quite limited for constitutional reasons and sometimes for basic political reasons. Actually, we are working to publish a study by the end of this year about the demographic scenarios of France in the 21st century. What we can say now is that the trend is towards a progressive reduction of the share of what we could call native French or European descent French, and a rise of people from non-EU immigrant background. For example, if you take a look once again at newborn babies, from the year 2000 till now, the annual number of newborn babies with 2 parents born in France has fallen by 28%, and over the same period of time, the number of newborn babies born to 2 parents born outside of the European Union has risen by 73%. So on the one end, you've got a native birth rate which is declining, and on the other end, you've got a birth rate originating from non-European immigration, which is quickly on the rise. But I do think that public policy can still manage to keep France a society cohesive enough, coherent enough, peaceful enough, to be a society to live in by the end of the century. But this needs to do 2 things. This requires to do 2 things. One, of course, is to get a grip on immigration levels. And the second thing would be also to promote family policies. For a long time, France had a birth rate that was one of the highest in Europe. It has fallen over the last few years with different trends as I just described. But I do think that family policy can also be a way to temper demographic change.
Hasn't the French birth rate been historically low as compared to other European countries, and it's been trending downwards? If you look back kind of hundreds of years, you've had problems with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Over the 19th century, France was one of the very first European countries to experience what is called demographic transition, so a lower birth rate, especially. I mean, the population of Europe exploded in the 19th century, but it only risen a little in France. But after the Second World War, after 1945, France has put into practice one of the most ambitious and large family policies of the whole of Europe. And for a long time, it did not work that bad. I mean, still in 2010, the birth rate in France was around 2 children per woman. So it was the highest in Europe, along with Ireland. Last year, it fell to 1.62 children per woman, so it is an all-time low fertility rate. It has never been that low since World War I, actually. But as I described, this declining birth rate, this declining fertility rate actually covers various trends depending on immigrant or non-immigrant background.
So I mentioned French colonialism, and you mentioned the First World War. I'm curious to know whether the Second World War comes into these arguments around immigration in France at all. In Britain, again, the Second World War does come up. We talk about Winston Churchill being a racist, and these people fought in D-Day to fight the fascists and be for equality and so on. Does the Second World War come up and sort of loom over France? I don't know, the guilt about Vichy and everything. Does that come into these debates at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the strength of this kind of reference tends to be declining because, I mean, it's been so used and so ridiculously used that it's now often laughed at in the public sphere when it's used. But yet, of course, for a long time, the idea that government had a responsibility into preserving some level of social and cultural cohesion within France was seen as some sort of post-Vichyist idea. The idea that, for example, even the very idea that you should be able to have reliable ethnic data in France, ethnicity data, migrant background data, was also seen as some sort of Vichy-inspired idea because we've got this old and very noble in some ways idea of French universalism that once you're French, no matter what your ethnicity is, it should not appear or count in any way, which is of course a noble idea. But facts also matter, and even though France has never actually endorsed a state multiculturalism as it was done in Britain or as it was done in Germany or in the Netherlands, it has actually become a multicultural society. And now we need to have the means to understand this society and to put in place policies that are well informed.
When it comes to French resistance, forgive the term, to immigration over the last 30 years, you've had obviously the National Front, the Front National, and they've been seen as extremists and on the far right in France, and they've lost elections, but obviously their share of the vote has been increasing over the last 20 years. Do you think they've helped or hindered the people in France who want to restrict immigration, who want to cut immigration? Were they seen as kind of, we have to increase immigration to defeat these awful far-right fascists?
Well, I would say that for sure immigration was captured by Front National in the French political debate, but it was basically captured because all the other political parties had given up on even addressing this issue. In the 1980s, when Jean-Marie Le Pen rose to prominence in France, he was the very first politician of his kind to actively talk about immigration, about the perils of uncontrolled immigration. The bad thing was that he had other ideas on other things. He also talked a lot about the Second World War, actually, in very unwise manners. And for a long time, you're right. When you were trying to tackle the immigration issue in French politics, you were always sent back to Le Pen, to Front National. So today's Rassemblement National is quite different from what Front National used to be. But still, it has taken much time, for example, for the French mainstream conservatives to actually take on the issue. Now it's the case. Now you've got a Home Office minister in France, Bruno Retailleau, who actively talks about immigration. But the thing is, it was the same for the Conservative Party in Britain. Over the last 20 years, the issue was more talked about, but it wasn't actually addressed. It wasn't actually tackled. So, for example, when Bruno Retailleau, the leader of Les Républicains, the classical centre-right party, talks about his will to reduce significantly immigration, he has to confront with a lack of public trust towards this party. So all these parties, apart from Rassemblement National, now have to repair the lack of trust of the public on this specific issue of immigration.
There's a huge discussion in Britain about deportations, particularly on illegal migration. And actually, we've had a lot of illegal migrants come from the north coast of France, from Calais, into Britain in recent years, and that's caused a huge political problem, cultural problem, other problems as well. I presume in France you've got similar issues with illegal migration. If those migrants are already in France, then and they're coming to Britain, then you also have the problem. What's the kind of French political view of illegal migration? Can you talk about the illegal side of things, and also maybe mention about the Channel boats and how that's viewed in France?
Absolutely. Well, of course, it's sometimes difficult to approach the issue of illegal migration due to the lack of precise data that you can get on other sorts of legal migration. It's often estimated that there is now a bit less than 1 million illegal immigrants in France. It has been on the rise over the last 2 decades. One trustable metrics on it is the number of beneficiaries from the state medical aid, which is a specific health welfare aid in France for irregular migrants, whose number of beneficiaries has tripled over the last 20 years. So it attests to the wider upward trend of illegal immigration. I would say that in France, as in Britain perhaps, the focus on illegal immigration, which of course is a serious issue to be addressed, is sometimes used as a way to avoid talking about the bigger numbers which are actually legal. In France, it's estimated that the majority of irregular migrants actually came on a regular basis. You know, they had a temporary visa or they had a temporary residence permits, and then they overstayed it. So it shows that the idea that legal immigration is good, illegal immigration is bad, needs to be relativized, because even the limit, the difference between legal and illegal is often quite shallow, let's say. As far as the Calais situation is concerned, I mean, it's like an endless day on the coast of Calais. It has been so for 20 years. There's often this argument in France that Britain's working system, for example, Britain's lack of caution as regards ID, as regards the possibility for illegal immigrants to work on the British labour market, works as an active pull factor, which then has to be dealt with by the French authorities. I do think there's a point in it, but the two main issues to be addressed are upstream and downstream. Downstream are the pull factors in Britain, and upstream is the current state of EU border law. I mean, like the EU borders are very easy to cross. You know, when you look at the mandate given to Frontex, so the EU agency which is in charge of helping member states guarding the external borders of the EU, it's basically a schizophrenic mandate, because on the one hand they have to help states guard the external borders, but on the other hand they are committed to what is called the principle of non-refoulement, non-pushback. So they have to prevent people from crossing, but they cannot prevent people from crossing, because if they do, they will be charged under international law. Up until these upstream and downstream points are not addressed, the situation in Calais can barely get better, I'm afraid.
When it comes to French culture and civilization, do you feel that it's being eroded by migration?
Well, I would say many French have this feeling. There's a whole issue of religious-based habits, let's say, not even about religion itself, but for example about the place of women in the public sphere. I mean, France has a long tradition of what we call the courtoisie française, so this idea that women are more than welcome in the public sphere, that they are often deferred to, etc. And it's true that the habits of some immigrants coming from non-European countries, mostly from African or Middle Eastern countries, tends to conflict with this. And you can find it, for example, in the rates of unemployed immigrant women in some origins. For example, you've got more than 65% of Turkish women in France who are not working. So of course it's a record high level. I know that there's the same kind of levels in Britain as regards Bangladeshi women, for example, or women from this kind of countries. And for a long time it was thought that things were going to get better naturally with time passing and generations coming. You know, we thought for a long time that the second or third generation would tend to adopt French and Western habits, and that there would be a gradual convergence towards French customs. It has to be stated that it's not the case. By many aspects, significant shares of the second or third generations may be considered less integrated culturally than the first generation of immigrants. And there's no actual easy solution to it. I mean, of course, you can do more about integration policies. You can do more about education as an instrument to make it easier for these immigrant descent people to share the French culture. But integration policy is a downstream issue. Up until you address the upstream issue, which is that of immigration, which is that of numbers, which is that of the non-stopping, ever-growing influx of immigrants, then there's barely a chance the problem can be solved.
There's a great book called Submission by Welbeck, and it describes France in the future as being a kind of Islamic society that's the government becomes Islamic and also far left, and they have a coalition to stop the far right from becoming in power. Do you envisage this fantasy as perhaps coming true in France? Are you worried about Islamic parties becoming part of a French government in the future?
So far, it hasn't been witnessed. I mean, there were a few tentatives of Islamist parties in local elections in France. They have not done that good as compared to other European countries like Belgium or the Netherlands, for example. I would say the Islamist strategy in France, the political Islam strategy, is more of an entrism strategy. There will be an inquiry commission in the French Parliament in the next few months about the links between some political parties and political Islam. So, of course, the target of this inquiry commission is mostly Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, La France Insoumise. And I would tend to think that political Islam will work more actively to do entrism in the established parties than to actually set up parties of their own. Because if you look, for example, at the tactics of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is one of the most well-organized and most powerful Islamist networks in the Western world, actually, you see that they try not to worry too much surrounding society. So having a strictly Islamist party would not work that well on the short term. But I mean, on the longer term, everything is possible because demographics is destiny, and the Muslim population in France is growing. So perhaps there will be one day a political market for a party of this kind.
And finally, what's your prediction ahead of 2027? Obviously, Macron can't run again. Do you think that Bardella has a chance? This is the Front National, or National Rally, I should call them, candidate. Do you think he has a chance of winning?
Well, so far there's still a slight possibility that Marine Le Pen could be able to run. She appealed for the decision that made her impossible to run for the next presidential election. Actually, it's very hard to foresee. In the latest general election, the snap election that took place 1 year ago in France, many people were expecting a Rassemblement National victory, and yet it was visible that there was still this anti-Rassemblement National reflex in some parts of the French electorate. So even though Rassemblement National clearly now is the strongest party, Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella are always polled as the most popular politicians in France, there's still a chance that this anti-Rassemblement National reflex could work again. I would say that in the prospect of a Rassemblement National versus a post-Macronist candidate, some sort of center-right candidate, it seems likely that the center-right candidate would win. But for example, if Rassemblement National was opposed to Jean-Luc Mélenchon, so the hard-left candidate, well, for the first time, Rassemblement National would be seen as the reasonable and peaceful party, as opposed to the party of chaos. And in this case, anything would be possible.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. That was fantastic.
That was my pleasure. Thank you.